Wales, home of myths and legends, a place of tales of King Arthur. Wales is home to many stories and just as many historical figures, which we will explore. But to start off with, we need to understand what the country of Wales is and how it developed. So the word Wales itself comes from the Anglo-Saxons, who called the native Britons, or Brythonic, Walasg and Walisg, meaning foreigner, but the Welsh would originally have referred to themselves as Britons and spoke Brythonic. The word that would later evolve into Welsh now comes from the 7th century. Cymrogi, the Brythonic word meaning fellow countryman, or Cymri. From 78 AD, most of Britain was part of the Roman Empire. Parts of Wales would simply be part of Roman Britain, with various tribes now subjugated by Rome. It was towards the end of the Western Roman Empire that a transformation started to occur in Britain, as Rome had left Britain to its own fate sometime around the 5th century. But even before that, the garrisons of Britain had been depleted over the last 50 years or so. In 383, Magnus Maximus, or Maxen Wledig, as he's known in Welsh, took a good part of the garrisons stationed in Britain for campaigns in Gaul and Spain in order to claim the imperial throne. Magnus was later killed by the forces of Emperor Theodosius in 388. The garrison in Roman Britain never returned to their full strength, and with a weakening grip, parts of Roman Britain changed either back to a more tribal style, with one strong man and his retinue controlling a small area, or Roman Britain simply keeping calm and carrying on with everyday life. But the sources of solid information is difficult to gather, as there is a lack of sources around the next few centuries, but we do have archaeological evidence. By the 5th century, Roman Britain began to transform. In the year of 407, Constantine III took the garrison from Roman Britain to Gaul and never returned. Coins featuring Constantine have only ever been found in the southeast of Britain. Wales was now facing attacks and raids from Ireland, but some Irish tribes began to settle in Wales, some in the northwest and others in the southwest. Constantine was killed in 411, and the Roman Emperor Honorius left the Britons to their own devices. What happened in Wales after this point is difficult to show a coherent timeline of events. The monk Gildas is one of our primary sources for what happened in the now emerging Kingdom of Wales, but his account isn't in the style of a chronicler and is more of an angry sermon at the kings in Britain. We know the Britons did fight off a raiding party in 411, but the details only mention the Britons defeating the raiders, no account of who led each party, or the casualties, or even the number of combatants. The Greek historian Zosimus mentions this raid, and Gildas states that the Britons took up arms. Later legends tell of a former emperor's son leading the forces called Owain. There is a traditional view for the end of Roman rule in Britain, with it ending in 410. But as mentioned, parts of Wales could have already changed to small tribal states or Roman Britain communities, or even new ones from Ireland before 410. Archaeological evidence of large amounts of coins and silverware dating before 410 could imply that some rich Roman Britons felt the need to hide such treasures, as the situation in Roman Britain was unstable or even dangerous in some parts. We know raiding was common in coastal parts either from the Irish or Picts, but in places far from the coastline, the situation could be very different for the people there. But it's not like the Romans in Britain suddenly packed up everything and left on vast amounts of ships into Gaul or Roman Spain, even if the message from the emperor was, look after yourselves from now on. But without Roman rule, the people of Britain had to look locally for leadership, and that is where some of the historical figures we will come across may have arisen from. The early Middle Ages are also referred to sometimes as the Dark Ages, but there was no fall back to a barbarian way of life. It was more of a transformation into something else. As trade still continued, although not on such a large scale as before, we know this because Irish craft goods have been found in Dinas Powys and Dinas Emrys, glass and pottery which came from Athens and Gaul, and even a Byzantine intaglio. Agricultural work scaled down to a more local level, as there was not such a massive beast such as the Roman army to feed now. The period of 400 to 600 AD is incredibly important to the development of the Welsh kingdoms. However, it's important to state that again, there is no clear timeline of this period, only one's interpretations and debates on what happened, as each part of what would become the Welsh kingdoms were different in how Romanised or Celtic they were. One of our sources, the Early Medieval Wales, a framework for archaeological research, states, "There is little convincing evidence for the continued use of Roman, urban or military sites, including those which remained in occupation during the 4th century. We can look at this in 3 ways. Firstly, the abandonment of urban Roman structures, like villas in the southwest of Wales, could again be due to rich Romans leaving Britain for safer parts of the empire. This would have been supported by the catches of coins found. Secondly, because of the collapsing economy, there may not have been the funds or the material to maintain such infrastructure, as the coinage was now obsolete in Britain, and a return for trading for goods commenced. With these changes happening, the new emerging Welsh kingdoms would have formed around these changes, and thirdly, some Welsh hill forts were later used as foundation for Anglo-Norman castles, so these sites may have been repopulated at the start of the 5th century. Wales in the early Middle Ages had many kingdoms. We don't know much about the earliest kingdoms, but some do have at least a shared history with some Roman emperors, and others with the Irish. The kingdom of Dyfed is one example. The area in which the kingdom was formed was inhabited before the Roman conquest by a tribe called the Demeti, but during the Roman occupation, the area was a target for raids by the Irish, and by the 4th century the land would be settled or suffer incursions by an Irish tribe, called the Desi, who were driven out of Ireland. The story is from a medieval Irish tale called The Expulsion of the Desi, and tells this tale. Orchid, son of Archop, with his descendants, went over the sea into the land of Dyfed, and his sons and grandsons died there, and from them descended the race of Crintham over there. The Historia Brittonium mentions them settling in West Wales, and Welsh genealogies from the royal line of Dyfed lists Irish names, but they also list Roman names later on, so there are 2 origin stories on this kingdom. One where the Irish tribe settled, and one with a Roman origin dating back further than the arrival of the Irish tribe, perhaps for more of a pedigree Roman connection, to enable the Welsh kings in Dyfed to claim to be the truest rulers of the kingdom and the most legitimate, but it's hard to prove and can sometimes only matter to a king with a firm grasp of power in the kingdom, who is also looking further to cement his authority, and claiming to be a pedigree of Roman rulers is good propaganda. But there are several inscribed stones in the southwest of Wales dated in the 5th century and beyond. Some have been inscribed in Latin, while some have been in Irish Ogham, which is an early Middle Ages alphabet. Magnus Maximus appears as the connection for the king of Dyfed to claim lineage to Rome, but the evidence points to a more Irish connection. Gwynedd was home to the native tribe of the Ordovicists and the Deciangli. After the Roman conquest, the area was more of a military hub than a civil settlement, meaning the people in the area didn't become as Romanised as South Wales, but like Dyfed, parts of the area were settled by the Irish around the late Roman period, and there were also inscribed memorial stones with Irish names on them dated around the 6th century, but compared to Dyfed, the Irish settlements were smaller. The Historia Brittonium tells of the legend of how Gwynedd came to be, and of the ancestors of Maelgwyn Gwynedd. Canada, with his sons who numbered 8, had come formerly from the northern parts, that is the region called Manai of Gododin. 146 years before Maelgwyn ruled, they expelled the Irish with very great destruction from these regions, so that they never came back again to live there. But as we know, the Irish were not driven out, as stones inscribed in the 5th century contest this story. There is evidence of a settlement in Cleen. The sons of Canada may have named the territories in Gwynedd, or the territories were named after the sons. However, the story of how the Kingdom of Gwynedd formed supports the theory of a Brythonic warlord settling in the area and forming the kingdom, as archaeological evidence has found burial sites and forts similar to ones in the north of Britain, especially in the Fife area, offering a theory that a warlord from that area came and conquered the now Kingdom of Gwynedd around the 5th century. The Kingdom of Powys. In one of our sources, The History of Wales by John Davies, he describes the name. Powys probably comes from the word pagus. Both therefore are cognate with the word pagan. It is believed that the nucleus of the Kingdom of Powys was the Pagnus or the hinterland of the territory of the Corvorni, and that Powys expanded to include not only the territory, the rich land of the middle Severn Valley, but also the lands between the upper reaches of the river Wyn and Dee. The traditional story of how Powys formed was that Vortigern was the founder of the dynasty of Gethonion. But another tale tells us he married a woman called Severa, who was the daughter of Roman Emperor Magnus Maximus, giving another connection to Rome. But we will cover the problematic name of Vortigern in another episode. There isn't much evidence telling us about the early kingdom. We know it was heavily Romanized, with plenty of Roman settlements still in use after Rome's withdrawal. Venter Salorum, Cowent, and even as far as Vericonium in the now county of Shropshire. The Kingdom of Gwent. We have little information on how the Kingdom of Gwent formed after the Roman withdrawal. Our sources for the early kings of Gwent only list names and no other details. The Book of Llandaff, a 12th century source, only states names as well. The Kingdom of Glywysing. Magnus Maximus once again appears in the creation of this kingdom. Taldwig claims descendant from Magnus, but more information is scarce as some of the smaller petty Welsh kingdoms are mixed or were ruled over by other kingdoms and later formed new ones. The rest of the kingdoms did have their own kings, but again they're only names and no other information, and some are twisted into legends with no historical context, only names. And as the kingdoms rose, they would be conquered by stronger rivals or subjugated by them, as several Welsh figures would rise to become major figures in Welsh history, and we will explore them in the next episodes. So now that we've explored the background of the kingdoms of Wales and the Roman withdrawal from Albion, we can now explore the historical figures from early Middle Ages Wales. But before that, we need to cover one individual who is connected to quite a few Welsh royal dynasties, and that is the Roman Emperor Magnus Maximus, or Maxen Wledig. Magnus was a Roman soldier from the Roman provinces in Hispania. In 380 AD, he was stationed in Roman Britain and successfully defended the Roman provinces there from the Picts in the north of modern-day Scotland. By 383, Magnus was proclaimed Roman Emperor and left Roman Britain with most of the garrison that was stationed there, and ruled in the western parts of the Roman Empire before being defeated by another rival in 388. Magnus surrendered, but was later executed by this emperor. There are many stories of legends involving Magnus in early Welsh history. One such story is called the Dream of Maxen Wledig, in which the emperor dreams of seeing an old king on his golden throne, and near him is a beautiful woman. Magnus awakes and begins his quest to find and marry this woman of his dreams, eventually finding her in Carnarvon. Magnus's name is later inscribed on the Pillar of Elysee, erected in the 9th century. Magnus is referred to as a king, and his daughter also married Vortigern, a Briton leader. But as we've shown, a connection to a Roman emperor for some Welsh kings is propaganda to link legitimacy. as he is also mentioned in the Welsh Triads, a collection of Middle Ages manuscripts dated around the 13th century. Geoffrey of Monmouth also makes use of Magnus in his fictitious story of the history of the kings of Britain. With the Roman Empire withdrawal, many kingdoms emerged from the vacuum of power and new settlements began to develop. Regarding the migration of Germanic peoples, some Germanics were already settled in Britain, as they fought for Rome as foederati, and it's been suggested that some Saxons and Frisians were offered to settle in the east of modern England by the Roman administration around 320 to 350 AD. But by the 5th century, according to Gildas, Britain was overrun by the Saxons, who he described as the vengeance of God upon the Britons for their sins, which is a typical condemnation of something you'll find in the Bible. But he does mention one man who he describes as a gentleman who, perhaps alone of the Romans, had survived the shock of this notable storm. Certainly his parents, who had worn the purple, were slain in it. His descendants in our day have become greatly inferior to their grandfather's excellence. Under him, our people regained their strength and challenged the victors to battle. The Lord assented, and the battle went their way. Gildas names this man Ambrosius Aurelianus, or Ambrose Aurelian, and his tale is incredibly heroic, with an intriguing backstory. His parents were killed by the Saxons in their invasion. The theory is now that the Saxon invasion is now a migration, and whenever fighting occurred, it was more likely it was kingdoms fighting other kingdoms rather than Saxons versus Britons, with the only exceptions being raiding, like the one that was reported in 411 AD. Ambrose's origin is implied as part of the Roman Briton elite, as Gildas states his family won the purple, which means his family may have belonged to the aristocracy, giving him the authority of being a leader to help defend his people from the Saxons. If we look at the archaeological evidence of widespread destruction during the 5th to 6th century, one of our sources, The Kings and Queens of Wales by Timothy Venning, states, "It is now apparent from archaeology that there was less physical destruction in the 5th century that was supposed earlier. The physical destruction in towns, with a mixture of signs of fires and piles of body, indicating violent attacks, is most apparent at 3 towns in the southeast, easy access to 5th century raiders: Colchester, Norwich, and probably Lincoln. These cases can be safely regarded as due to violence, and their geographical location would suggest the responsibility of seaborne invaders. The signs of violent destruction at Roman forts is only apparent at the smaller, isolated Yorkshire coastal lookout points that would have been vulnerable to seaborne Picts or Saxons." There are theories that Gildas created Ambrosius for a story for his contemporaries to follow and used Ambrosius as a glorious example. Gildas even condemns Ambrosius's descendants as having fallen to sinful ways. But there is also a theory that Ambrosius was a relative to Saint Ambrose, a bishop of Milan whose family was called the Ambrosi. The Historia Britannicum mentions a rivalry between Ambrosius and another Briton leader called Vortigern, but this account is dated around 820 to 850 AD and is attributed to a Welsh monk called Nennius, who himself is subject to legends. Gildas mentions a battle at Mons Badonicus, or Mount Badon, which according to Gildas happened in the year he was born, 500 AD, and that the Britons won over the Saxons and peace was restored for about 50 years. But again, Gildas comments that the Britons had fallen to their sinful ways. Gildas does not state that Ambrosius led this particular battle, but that he did defeat the Saxons in various engagements, which culminated at Mount Badon. Nennius offers this victory to Arthur, yet Gildas does not mention a Arthur at all. We do know by 490 AD many Anglo-Saxon settlements had been created, as archaeological evidence shows settlements around the Thames Valley, which would become the Kingdom of Wessex, so the idea of a battle against this new emerging kingdom or its people between a rival kingdom is justified, and one kingdom being possibly led by Ambrosius is an interesting story to tell. Vortigern is a complex name, as the name may have been a title rather than a personal name, as the word Vortigern appears in many stories and legends, and the name translates to overlord or overking in Brythonic. The name doesn't actually appear in Gildas's account. Gildas states, "Then all the councillors, together with that proud tyrant, the British king, were so blinded that as a protection to their country, they sealed its doom by inviting in among them, like wolves into the sheepfold, the fierce and impious Saxons, a race hateful both to God and men, to repel the invasion of the northern nations." Later accounts would link this Briton king as Vortigern. One of the stories tells us of how a proud tyrant and his council invited 3 ships of Saxons to Britain to fight for them against the Picts and other Celts, and to accommodate these new troops they were given land in eastern England, but would later make various complaints about the land, and would then start to raze and plunder in order to get what they wanted. Settlements were burned and left in ruins, and many Britons were killed or fled Albion. The Anglo-Saxon monk Bede tells us in his History of the English Church and People that the tyrant was Vortigern, but Bede's story tends to jump to a more legendary tale involving the 2 Saxon brothers, Hengist and Horsa, as Gildas again mentions no names of the Saxon leaders. Vortigern in Welsh history comes from the Welsh monk Nennius and the Historia Brittonium, and the name may have also come from the Latin of Vitalis or Vitalinus. Some Welsh traditions link him to Gloucester, where one of his ancestors originally came from. He has also been given the nickname in some Welsh tales as Gorthen, the thin or repulsive, due to him speaking a Saxon language. Nennius lists him as one of the kings of Powys, as he fled there after the Saxon invasion and the betrayal at the peace conference. Nennius also tells us that this Vortigern fled to the left-handed parts of Wales, and Bede states the kingdoms of the Angles, Saxons and Jutes were established by 446 AD, but all our sources agree that there was no sudden Saxon takeover of Albion, and the theory is that most of Britain was held by the Britons for at least a century after the Roman withdrawal. A single specific Vortigern is difficult to pin down, simply for the many stories there are that involve someone of that name, and with Gildas being the closest source we have on the kings of Britain around that time. As mentioned before, Gildas does not refer to a Vortigern at all, and later chroniclers, especially Geoffrey of Monmouth, contort a Vortigern to unimaginable levels of inaccuracy to suit either a specific need for a story or for propaganda purposes. Gildas and the 5 Kings. As mentioned before, Gildas's angry sermon tells us about the loss of Britain to the Saxons, and in the second part of his work on the ruin and conquest of Britain, Gildas talks about 5 Briton kings, condemning them for their misrule and sinfulness, and calls them tyrants. The first king Gildas mentions is called Constantine, who he describes as the whelp of the unclean lioness of Damonia. This area is now modern-day Cornwall. Gildas chastises Constantine heavily and accuses him of the murder of 2 royal youths, and further accuses him of hanging their arms on the city gates. Gildas further mentions the sin of adultery and that Constantine committed the sin repeatedly, before advising him to repent unless he wants to kindle in hell. This suggests that this king was alive at the time of Gildas's writing and may have even read this condemnation. The next king Gildas targets is called Aurelius Coninu, who he accuses of the same sins as he did against Constantine, but that Aurelius was thirsting after civil wars and the spoils of war. Gildas again directly addresses Aurelius by reminding him of his parents and brethren who died in their youth. Gildas beseeches him that he should find salvation, or he will be tormented in hell. Unfortunately, Gildas does not tell us which kingdom Aurelius ruled. Vortigern is described as a spotted leopard whose head is now growing grey and who has committed a great many sins. Gildas quite cruelly notes that his end of life is now approaching by the day, and that his wife had an honourable death, and that he should spend what time he had left beseeching God for forgiveness. Vortigern was king of Dyfed, but that's all we know. Gyneglacis was a prince of a small kingdom in the north of Wales that would be later incorporated into the kingdom of Gwynedd. Gildas unsurprisingly condemns him for his sins and for creating a great war against his own kin. Reading Gildas's writing, it seems the biggest sin committed is always adultery or the sin of lust. Gildas goes on to describe that Gyneglacis needed to seek out and enter the true state of existence, or he shall suffer in the fires of hell. And our fifth king, who Gildas calls the most powerful and who had defeated the most tyrants and kingdoms, Maelgwn Gwynedd. Gildas states that Maelgwn exceeded many in power but also in malice, and that he stands above all for the amount of sins committed. Yet Maelgwn funded many religious building projects across Wales. He is also recorded as a great-grandson of Canada. Yet his death was due to what was called the Yellow Plague, which given the era around the 6th century may have been the plague of Justinian, which we now know is the bubonic plague. Now that we've explored the 5 kings by Gildas, we can now move on and discover kings who are not consistently condemned as sinners by the source material. Rhyn the Tall, son of Maelgwn Gwynedd, king of Gwynedd. During Rhyn's reign, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms began to expand and capture several important cities, such as Salisbury in 552 AD, clashing with the Briton kingdoms, as well as other Germanic kingdoms for territories. Migration to Brittany by the Britons was still continuing. For the reign of Rhyn, his kingdom must still have been affected by the plague that took his father, the plague of Justinian. John Davies, in his book The History of Wales, offers a theory on the effects of the plague on the Britons. The success of the English after 550 may have resulted in part for the instability of the Britons to resist them because they had been enfeebled by the plague. He then further suggests that the English avoided old Roman cities due to fear of the plague, which, if this plague was as deadly as the Black Death of 1346 to 1353, then it most likely decimated the local population. Recent scientific studies of archaeological sites containing victims of the plague in Britain have shown the bacteria arrived in 544 AD. Rhyn's father, Maelgwn Gwynedd, died in 547 AD from the plague. The plague not only infected the Britons, but also the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, as the site where the samples were taken from was at Edic's Hill in Cambridgeshire. The effects of the plague could have contributed to more Anglo-Saxon control of Britain, or even the opposite, stemming the tide of migration into Britain. How Rhyn managed his kingdom during the plague is unknown. We do know that Rhyn was active with his army as he led a campaign up through the Pennines, a region of hills and mountains in the north of now England, towards Pictland, using the Roman roads. For what reasons we can only guess, marching that far given the era. Several later chronicles dated around the 13th century stated that Rhyn marched with his army to displace his northern rivals and occupied the area for a time. Rhyn's story ends with his death in an unknown battle or skirmish. Iago ap Belli, grandson of Rhyn, reigned from 599 to 1616 AD. We have hardly any information on his kingship. His death in the year 1616 was also when a major battle was fought at Chester between the kingdoms of Powys and the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Mercia. The battle's most famous aspect is the murder of the monks from the monastery of Bangor-on-Dee by the king of Mercia, who was a pagan, and where Iago is connected to this is he might have been among the monks, as he may have joined the monastery at some point towards the end of his life, or he may have even fought and died in the fighting, or his death in the same year could be a coincidence. Unfortunately, we don't have the full story. The Welsh triads give a different story of Iago being assassinated. Cadfan ap Iago, successor to Iago. We have no information on the reign of Cadfan, but reading his tombstone in Llangadwallada in Anglesey, it reads King Cadfan, most wise and renowned of all kings. Perhaps during his reign the kingdom experienced peace and prosperity. Cadwallon. We have more details on Cadwallon than most early kings of Wales, as during his reign Cadwallon had to deal with an ambitious king of Northumbria, Edwin, who invaded Wales, reaching as far as the Llyn Peninsula in North Wales, before turning his attention to Anglesey and trapping Cadwallon in a siege in the early 630s. He escaped to Ireland to recuperate before returning to his kingdom. Like a reinvigorated king from a long slumber, Cadwallon set about defeating his enemy and reclaiming his kingdom. He managed to secure an alliance not with another Welsh king, but King Penda of Mercia, a pagan Anglo-Saxon kingdom. This may have been the first time a Welsh king allied with an Anglo-Saxon king. Thanks to this alliance, Cadwallon drove Edwin out of Gwynedd, winning some 14 battles, which later poems would tell us about. And thanks to the combined might of Gwynedd and Mercia, Edwin's own kingdom would be invaded. And at the climactic battle of Hatfield Chase, Edwin was slain. We have no details on the battle itself, no account for the numbers present, the tactics used, or formations. All we know is that Edwin was dead by the end of the battle. Further fighting continued in Northumbria as Cadwallon defeated and killed two of Edwin's successors, leaving Cadwallon as the ruler of Northumbria. No Welsh king had controlled this much of Britain since the Roman withdrawal. The main source for Cadwallon's story comes from Bede, and just like Gildas before him, Bede writes a scathing condemnation of a Briton king. Bede goes on to describe that Cadwallon set about to destroy the entire English race. Yet there is a contradiction here, as if Cadwallon sought to permanently remove the English from the Isle of Britain, then why would he have allied with the pagan king of Mercia? We could argue Cadwallon sacked the lands of Northumbria, as that is the nature of medieval warfare, and was a common practice at the time. After all, Cadwallon was on the defence at the start of the war against Edwin, so it makes sense to try and break a rival's kingdom in order to protect, or to even take the spoils of war and expand. Regardless of Cadwallon's long-term plans for Northumbria, they would never come to fruition, as Edwin's son Oswald defeated and killed Cadwallon at the Battle of Heavenfield. Cadwallon having a degree of fame was used in Geoffrey of Monmouth's tales, but as mentioned before, there was no historical context from Geoffrey, only pseudo-history. Before we continue to explore historical figures from Middle Ages Wales, it's important to explain the Celtic Church in Wales and how the Church changed over time, and the Age of Saints, which occurred from the 5th to the 6th century AD in Wales, Ireland and Brittany. And like the historical figures from the era, there are mysteries, myths and legends. The earliest Christian object found in Wales is a vessel with the Christian symbol the Chiro on it, dated around 375 AD and found near the Roman town of Carwent. John Davies describes the early Celtic Church. The history of the Celtic Church has a great fascination, but so scarce is the contemporary evidence, and so abundant the stories invented in later centuries, usually with an ulterior motive, that it is difficult to distinguish between the true and the false. Perhaps the very term Celtic Church gives rise to confusion, for it was in fact an integral part of the universal church. The idea that it was proto-Protestant is a mistaken notion of reformers 1,000 years later. Indeed, it would be better to describe it as the church among speakers of the Celtic languages. Christianity was experiencing a rapid amount of changes during the 5th to the 6th century, and many discussions were had about the true nature of Christianity and the worship of Christ. With the arrival of the Germanic peoples into Albion, they brought with them their own religion of paganism, which would see the Roman Church sending missionaries to Britain in the 590s. But they would find the British Church had its own practices of worshipping God. In the next episode, we will explore some of these British bishops and saints from Wales. There are many saints from early Welsh history, some with a long rich history and some are simple short stories. Christianity has been a part of Wales since at least 1314 AD, as we have records of British bishops attending a council in 1314. All from different parts of Roman Britain, from Londinium to Carmarthen. The most famous saint from Wales and the patron saint of Wales is Saint David, or Dewi Sant. Saint David existed during a time called the Age of Saints in Wales, which, as the title implies, is the age in which a great many saints appeared to spread the word of God from Brittany through Wales, Ireland and Cornwall. This age started from the 5th century into the 6th century, so again, solid sources are hard to come by, but with St. David, we do have a lot of information and stories. The main source of information we have on St. David is from the Life of St. David by Rhygyfarch. This source is written around the 1090s, 500 years after St. David's death, but it does give us a valuable insight into the 6th century. The Welsh-Irish connection is present for the story of St. David, as he is featured in 2 feast days in Irish martyrologies, which is a calendar for saints. The 2 scriptures are from Ungus the Coldee and Martyrology of Tala. But as for a biographical account, we rely back to the life of St. David. We don't know the date of St. David's birth, but we can estimate that he was born around 500 to 520 AD in the kingdom of Ceredigion to King Sant, and his mother was called Non, and came from the kingdom of Dyfed. Yet there was no love between the parents, as David was conceived forcefully from Sant lusting after Non. At the time of St. David's birth, the life of St. David begins to parallel stories from the Bible. For example, the ruler of a local area threatened to kill the unborn David, feeling fear by his arrival. But come the eve of St. David's birth, a powerful storm whipped up. Lightning crashed with an onslaught of hail and rain. During this tumultuous storm, David's mother Non made her way to a ruined chapel with a healing well. Whilst the storm thundered on, Non was protected by a holy light while she delivered the baby David. The notion that St. David shared a few traits with Jesus Christ is due to the author trying to establish the independence of the Welsh Church, as his father met King William the Conqueror in 1081. So by having an account of the man who founded the Welsh Church, it helps legitimise it, similar to Welsh kings using genealogy to connect them with Roman emperors. And to remind ourselves that the source's goal is to promote St. David in a way that certain traits of his will be embellished, but it still tells us a fascinating story. The next chapter of St. David's life starts at the monastery at Henvenw near Aberystwyth. The description of this monastery is that it had an ancient well which stood at the northern part of the churchyard, and that the church was near the banks of the Eron, with its clover-filled meadows and acorn-loaded trees. By 545 AD, St. David was now the leader of the movement in Albion to oppose the teachings of Pelagius, which taught the people that everyone could be received in heaven through their own efforts rather than relying on God's grace. This was seen as heresy by the Catholic Church, and to combat this, a synod was held, which is a meeting of Christian figures. And at one of these meetings, in a place where 3 Roman roads met, near Carmarthen, a large gathering occurred, with many voices talking over each other. St. David, who is described as being 6 foot tall, struggled to speak to the masses. The life of St. David describes what happens next. Then, at the appointed place called Brevi, they endeavoured to preach. Then David made his way to the synod. The assembly of bishops rejoiced, the people were glad, and the whole gathering exulted. The earth under him swelled and was raised to a hill. A church is situated on top of that hill now. This is just one of the many miracles attributed to St. David. During the same address, a white dove is said to have landed on St. David's shoulder, and many of his depictions show him with the white dove on his shoulder. The dove represented holiness. Another miracle attributed to him is about a flock of bees, and the story goes that an Irish monk and follower of St. David, known as St. Moddernock, he cared for a flock of European honeybees at St. David's monastery, tending to them with great care and delicacy whilst harvesting the honey and wax they produced. When it was time for Moddernock to return to Ireland and preach, the bees were enamoured for him, and when Moddernock boarded a ship bound for Ireland, the bees followed him. Moddernock, not wanting to take the bees as they belonged to the monastery, returned them. But each time he got back to the ship, the bees would be right behind him. 3 times he returned them, until St. David offered his blessings and stated that Moddernock may take the bees to Ireland with him. This is one story of how the honeybees were introduced into Ireland. A short story about St. David is that when the Saxons invaded, St. David advised his fellow Britons to wear leeks on their helmets to recognise each other, as their armour was similar to the Saxons. A lifelong vegetarian, St. David also only drank water, as he followed a typical monastic life, praying daily, keeping few or no possessions. St. David made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, where he was made a bishop and given several gifts: a bell, a golden tunic, a staff, and finally a portable high altar, the eye altar. St. David would found many monasteries in Albion, including his own in Pembrokeshire, where he and his disciples would practice what was referred to as in imitation of the monks of Egypt. With his community established, the monks would plough the field without oxen, and then followed the typical monk life of praying daily, as well as reading and writing. St. David's death is recorded on the 1st of March 589 AD, which became his saint day. His last words were reported being, "Be joyful, keep the faith, do the little things you have seen me do." Although St. David is the patron saint of Wales, there is still plenty of other saints from Welsh history whose stories are just as fascinating. Some of the next few saint stories offer some lovely tales of human nature, but others have a dark tone to them. The next story involves a tale of unrequited love or desire. Saint Winifred or Gwenffawi is reported to have lived around the 7th century in North Wales at Holywell, and like St. David, details on her life come from sources written much later. The first one is a Welsh manuscript written in 1135, giving us details on her life and a list of miracles she is said to have performed. And the second one is from an Englishman called Robert, who was the Prior of Shrewsbury, who wrote his version in 1138. We will be following the Welsh version. So to begin, Winifred was a member of Welsh royalty in the north of Wales, and her uncle was Saint Bino, who at some point began to educate the young Winifred on one of her father's estates. During one average day for Winifred, where she would be committed to her tasks, a prince called Cadoc of a nearby kingdom approached her and demanded she marry him. Saint Winifred refused, and in a fury, Cadoc attacked her. Winifred fled to a nearby church, but as she got to the door, Cadoc caught her and chopped her head off. In one account, her head rolls into the church, and where it stopped, a holy well is formed. Horrified at what had transpired, Saint Bino took Winifred's head and placed it next to her body, and prayed that she might be resurrected. Suddenly, Winifred was made whole again, with a white scar across her neck to symbolise her martyrdom. As for Cadoc, he was struck dead, and the earth is said to have opened up and his body fell into the earth. The other version in the life of Saint Bino changes the story to fit a narrative similar to one in the Bible where Jesus resurrected a person. You'll find these parallels in other saint stories, and we've already covered one like this in St. David's tale. The other version states, "Then Bino took the girl's head and placed it back with the body, covering the body with a cloak, and saying to her mother and father, who were mourning for her, "Be quiet for a little while, and leave her until the Mass is over." Then Bino celebrated the sacrifice to God. When the Mass was finished, the girl rose up, entirely healed, and dried the sweat from her face. God and Bino healed her. Where her blood fell to the earth, a spring was formed, which even today still heals peoples and animals. Many who had seen what happened began to believe in Christ. Saint Winifred would go on to establish a covenant of nuns at Holy Well, which attracted pilgrims to visit the site and the Holy Well for its healing properties. Saint Winifred passed away at Gwytherin. Before we end on Saint Winifred, we will mention her hagiography and how her story borrows elements from an Irish Celtic goddess. Christianity uses pagan stories and mixes elements of the story into its own Christian mythology. As for Saint Winifred, the Holy Well may have been a pagan site of worship. Tysilio of Mayfod was from North Wales, and according to Welsh genealogies, Tysilio was a member of the royal family of the Kingdom of Powys around the later 6th century. Our main source of information about Tysilio comes from a Welsh poem titled Canu Tysilio, written in the 12th century. There is a later edition of the life of Tysilio from the 15th century in Latin. This edition is said to use parts of the now lost original Welsh version, but for another saint. Tysilio's story starts with him fleeing his family home and journeying towards a monastery at Mayfod, where he began to study for the monastic life under the abbot. Tysilio in his later life would found a church on Clan Tysilio Island, where he stayed for a time before returning to Mayfod to take up the position of abbot. In the poem Canu Tysilio, it mentions the building of the church. He raised a church with fostering hand, a church with bright lights and a chancel for offering, a church above the stream, by the glassy waters, a church of Powys, paradise most fair. The poem gives Tysilio a different story of him being a grand priest of the people of Powys and Gwynedd, but still the son of the king of Powys. As such, the poem tells us that Tysilio's first career was that of a warrior, which suits the son of an early Middle Ages king. The poem goes on to mention Tysilio fighting to defend his people from the Northumbrians at the Battle of Maserfield. The poem describes the event. The lamenting after the battle was a precious omen, attacking wonderfully in battle, powerfully causing devastation amidst the shouting of soldiers. In a fight of serpents, he was the serpent of chieftains. He stood his ground. May God stand by us. The Battle of Maserfield was a major battle in 642, in which the forces of Mercia, Gwynedd, and Powys all fought against the Kingdom of Northumbria and won. After this event, Tysilio settled in Brittany, establishing a monastery there, and later dying there. In another version, he is said to have died in Wales. Saint Melangell, one of the few female saints in Welsh history. Her story is even more obscure than most, as her story is from a manuscript which is dated nearly 800 years after her lifetime. But the manuscript may have been copied from earlier, now lost sources. Melangell's life begins in Ireland, as a member of royalty, as her father was an Irish chieftain, and like members of a Middle Ages royal family, Melangell would be expected to marry a noble for diplomatic reasons. Yet Melangell refused an arranged marriage on the grounds of her celibacy. She then fled to Wales at Pennant Melangell, where she would live for the next 15 years, before meeting a prince called Hywel Dda, who was out hunting with his hounds. Hywel's hounds had chased a hare, which fled towards Melangell and hid in her cloak as she was praying. What happened next is described from the book Celtic Saints of Wales by Elizabeth Rees. Then the prince cried, "Get it, hounds, get it!" But the more he shouted, urging them on, the further the dogs retreated, and howling fled from the little animal. Finally, the prince, altogether astonished, asked the girl how long she had lived on her own on his lands in such a lonely spot. In reply, the girl said that she had not seen a human face for these 15 years. Flabbergasted by her response, the prince, admiring her piety and dedication, offered her lands in the valley on which to build a covenant. The prince declared, "O most worthy virgin Melangell, I give and present to you the most willingly these my lands for the service of God, that they may be a perpetual asylum, refuge and defence, in honour of your name, excellent girl. But, on the other hand, if any wrongdoers who enjoyed the protection of your sanctuary shall set out in any direction to do harm, then the independent abbots of your sanctuary, who alone know of their crimes, shall, if they find them in that place, ensure that the culprits be released and handed over to the powis authorities in order to be punished." A church was eventually built near the valley in the 8th century, and the site was vast compared to the small church that is now left. As for St. Melangell, she spent the rest of her days as the first abbess of the now abbey for the next 37 years before passing away. She became the patron saint of hares, and her remains are said to have been buried in the local church, or the church was built around her tomb. As the site of the church predates Christianity, as archaeological research shows the site was originally a Middle Bronze Age cemetery, dating around 1200 BC. Whether the site was repurposed to build the church on the existing remains is unknown. The church itself has been reconstructed many times over the centuries, as the current building is dated from the 12th century onwards. The Romanesque shrine is argued to be one of the oldest shrines of its kind in Albion. Saint Cadoc. Hailing from the Kingdom of Gwent in South Wales, he was born into royalty, as his father was a prince of Gwent, and his mother was the daughter of King Brychan, the ruler of Banbacheniod. His story, like other saints, is written well after his time, some 500 years later in the 12th century by Llythris of Llanghaven. According to the life of Cadoc, Llythris mentions Cadoc's fondness of Roman culture, even lamenting that he will never meet his poet hero Virgil, as him being a pagan meant that they would never meet in heaven. Llythris states that Cadoc was educated in Cywent, one of the most Romanised parts of Wales. After his education, Cadoc set out to found a monastery, and thanks to his royal connections, he managed to be granted land near Barry Island. The monastery that would be built is known as the Church of Stags, as the story about the monastery is that 2 monks that Cadoc lived with had refused to dig the soil to determine the quality of the site. A pair of stags then arrived and began to till the ground with their antlers. This was seen as a blessing from God. When Cadoc founded the site of the monastery, he stayed in the area for the night, praying till the morning with 2 monks, and in the morning sun, a white boar appeared as a sign of where to build the monastery. A white boar appears in many stories about the founding of monasteries, written by sources much later after the saints' lives, but this particular monastery that was now created became a major centre of learning for monks until 988 AD, when a certain group of people with longboats attacked and destroyed the site. Cadoc would travel across Albion and Ireland, founding a monastery at Cambuslang in what is now Scotland, and creating tales of miracles along his journey, such as creating a holy healing well with a stick, similar to the tale of Moses in the Old Testament. In his later years, Cadoc settled at his monastery in Wales, and one of the tales of his death is that a Saxon warrior arrived at the church on his horse and then attacked Cadoc with a lance, killing him. Many of these saints have stories intertwined with royal figures of the surrounding Welsh kingdoms and their own native ones. By the late 7th century, the age of saints was over, and by this time most of Albion was Christian once again, although the Celtic Church would remain independent from the Catholic Church until at least the 8th century, not for any particular sinister reason, perhaps due to the isolation the Welsh experienced in Albion, as the now English kingdoms were still pagan. But they would eventually become Christian, which in turn meant that the Welsh Church now had to resist the now established English church in Canterbury. An example of this is the dating of Easter, as the Celtic church followed a different system from a time where the Western Roman Empire still existed. John Davies describes the disagreement in dating. The Celtic Church adhered to a system devised by the Western Church in 1314, while Rome followed a system adopted there in 457. But, even with the English kingdoms now Christian, the fighting for territories would reach new heights, as by the late 7th century, the English kingdoms were firmly rooted in southern Albion, and new challenges awaited the Welsh kingdoms and kings. The nation of the Welsh was conceived on the deathbed of the Roman Empire. It was born in the excitement of the Age of Saints, but its infancy was meagre and lonely, yet, as it shall be seen, it would have an exhilarating adolescence. Now the Age of Saints is over in Wales, and we enter the late 7th century towards the 8th century. The kingdoms of Wales would experience their greatest challenges yet, as the English kingdom of Mercia would reach its zenith of power, threatening the kingdoms in Wales of Gwynedd, Powys and Gwent. And a new source material would emerge, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, consisting of various annals compiled together, giving us another source to try and understand what was happening in Albion. But before we look at the conflicts involving the Welsh and the Mercians, let's check up on some of the other kingdoms of Wales and their history in the late 7th century. The Kingdom of Gwent. This kingdom is often tied with the Kingdom of Glywysing, due to the local royal dynasty being relatives. Information on this kingdom in the 7th century is scarce, but we do have a record of a climactic fight with the English in 630 AD. Where King Taldrig led the Welsh to victory at the cost of his life. John Davies mentions this in his History of Wales. According to tradition, the men of Gwent defeated the English in about 630 AD, a victory which thwarted English attempts to gain control of the northern coastlines of the Severn Sea. Their victory was among the most important events in the history of Wales. But despite this epic battle we don't know much about, archaeological evidence tells us that trade was alive and well between the kingdoms of the English and the Welsh kingdoms. A research framework for the archaeology of Wales states that fragmentary Anglo-Saxon objects from Dinas Powys and Dinorban imply some sort of contact and or trading with the Anglo-Saxon world. The apparent concentration of Anglo-Saxon metalwork in the southeast of Wales illustrates the wider cultural landscape for the Dinas Powys assemblage, and the diffusion of objects from England from the 6th century, if not earlier. Such finds may reflect the influence and political liaisons of kings of southeast Wales and the dynasty of the Kingdom of Gwent with the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms during this period. The Kingdom of Dyfed, the kingdom in which St. David was active around for most of his life in the early to late 6th century, but moving into the 7th century, there isn't much information regarding what was happening in Dyfed. A king of Dyfed married the sole princess of Brycheiniog, which gained him the throne of the kingdom, giving him a substantial amount of authority in South Wales. And in the Annals of Wales, a source dated around the 10th century states in 645 the hammering of the region of Dyfed when the monastery of David was burnt. We don't know the identity of the attackers. The Kingdom of Ceredigion. For this period in the history of the kingdom, we only have names of the kings, although one king invaded and annexed parts of Dyfed around the late to early 8th century, greatly expanding the kingdom. The Kingdom of Gwynedd. We've already covered a few kings from this kingdom, most notably Cadwallon and his campaigns, but by the time of Cadwallon's death, the kingdom was severely weakened, as his eventual successor, Cadwallon, is deemed a weak king and is referred to as a low-born king, and due to this weakness, Gwynedd was now on a weaker footing in terms of the power dynamic between Gwynedd and Mercia under Penda, who carried on his war with the Northumbrians. Cadwallon only managed to secure the throne as Cadwallon's son was too young to rule. But Cadwallon's fate was tied with Penda, who would later die at the Battle of Winwade in 655. He is reported to either have abandoned Penda or watched the battle from afar, awaiting the outcome. Regardless of the actions taken, Cadwallon's son, Hywel Dda ap Cadwallon, took charge of Gwynedd. His kingship is considered on par with his father's, given the length of his reign, although his kingdom experienced 2 great plague outbreaks, perhaps a resurgence of the plague of Justinian. The Annals of Wales record Hywel Dda's death, 682 AD, a great plague in Britain, in which Hywel Dda, son of Cadwallon of Gwynedd, dies. Hywel Dda is known for his association with the national flag of Wales, the Red Dragon, although we're not sure when the flag or symbol was first used, perhaps during the Roman occupation of Britain. We don't have a definitive answer. Hywel Dda's history is tied up with the pseudo-history of Geoffrey of Monmouth. As for his actual history, there isn't much. Looking at the Annals of Wales in the 680s, several horrible events took place. In 683, a plague in Ireland. In 684, a great earthquake in the Isle of Man. And in 689, to quote the annals, the rain turned to blood in Britain, and in Ireland, milk and butter turned to blood. As for Gwynedd, their next 2 kings ruled the kingdom for quite some time, but we only have their names, nothing about their rule or what was happening in the kingdom at the time. The Kingdom of Powys. We've already covered one major event the Kingdom of Powys was involved in either 613 or 616, the Battle of Chester, where the King of Powys was slain. With this defeat, the kingdom was split in 2, as a king from a sub-kingdom took over the northern parts of Powys. A sub-kingdom in Wales was a minor kingdom under the authority of a larger kingdom. Gwynedd had quite a few sub-kingdoms under its authority. Powys would eventually be whole again in the early 8th century. However, before its reunification, the kingdom would lose territory to the English kingdoms. A king of southern or northern Powys and the overlord of the sub-kingdom of Penguin fought alongside King Penda of Mercia, but after Penda's defeat and death, the Powys king is thought to have met his end at the same battle as Penda, although another tale has him defending and dying to protect the sub-kingdom of Penguin, which would eventually be attacked and destroyed by the resurgent kingdom of Northumbria. Poems written in the later centuries tell us the suffering Powys endured, as well as the complete destruction of the sub-kingdom. Germanic settlers would colonise this area, known in our time as Shrewsbury, yet the Welsh would launch efforts to retake this land, leading to the construction of a dyke, a fortified earthwork. But before we look into the creation of the earthworks, there is one final kingdom's history we need to cover beforehand. The Kingdom of Mercia. We will just give a quick summary of the kingdom, as the focus of this video is on Offa and the Welsh. Mercia's earliest history is the tale of legends, with a legendary king establishing the kingdom around the 6th century. The kingdom's capital is a town called Tamworth, and like kingdoms in Wales, Mercia had its own sub-kingdoms, which over time would be annexed and incorporated into Mercia. The years of 716 to 825 was the height of Mercian power. King Penda of Mercia set the course for the kingdom's supremacy. With his defeat and death, the kingdom went through a brief period of instability. But its power was soon back and grew even stronger under successive sons of Penda, until we get to perhaps the most famous king of Mercia, Offa. Offa acquired the throne of Mercia after a brief conflict with a thane who had taken the throne after the murder of the previous king. To demonstrate the power Offa could wield in the height of his reign, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles tell us that in 794, in this year, King Offa, king of the Mercians, ordered King Ethelbert's head to be struck off. He was the king of the East Angles. A testament to Offa's prestige is that Charlemagne, king of the Franks and the first Holy Roman Emperor, wrote to Offa in 796, calling him his dearest brother and to be a most strong protector of your earthly country. King Offa's most enduring legacy is the Offa's Dyke, a huge set of earthworks stretching from the north of the border of Wales and down to the south. King Offa's Dyke is the largest and longest one in Britain, but it is not the only one in Britain. The Offa's Dyke Association gives this description. Offa's Dyke is a linear earthwork which roughly follows the Welsh-English boundary. It consists of a ditch and rampart constructed with the ditch on the Welsh-facing side and appears to have been carefully aligned to present an open view into Wales from along its length. As originally constructed, it must have been about 27 metres wide and 8 metres from the ditch bottom to the bank top. The construction and origins of Offa's Dyke are obscure. Various theories are offered to us. One is that the dyke was constructed to protect Mercia from renewed Welsh kingdom attacks, as Powys had regained its strength and challenged the English at Hereford along with other Welsh kingdoms, as the Annals of Wales state. A battle between the Britons and the Saxons, that is, the Battle of Hereford. We don't know which Welsh king led the armies. Some sources say the King of Powys, while others are ambiguous about the leader of the army. Regardless, the Mercians may have initially built Wat's Dyke, which is a smaller dyke going from the north of Wales down to Shropshire. However, the origins of this dyke are also debatable, as parts of the dyke have been carbon dated to the early 9th century. But back to Offa's Dyke's origins, there is a suggestion that the dyke was built as a physical border between his kingdom and the Welsh kingdoms. The first recorded mention of the dyke in Chronicles is from a Welsh monk called Asa, who was the biographer of Alfred the Great. He states that the dyke went from sea to sea. The construction of such a grand earthworks would have taken years and would have required a massive amount of manpower. Parts of the dyke that were already under construction must have needed protection, as if the dyke was to be made without the consent of the Welsh kingdoms, they most likely would have tried to stop it from being built, as the design was such that Mercia could look far into the Welsh territories. How long the dyke took to build we don't know, and or if it incorporated existing earthworks from Roman Britain. More archaeological research is needed, but during the heyday of the dyke, it most certainly was used to look into Wales, and we have records of Offa raiding parts of Wales in 778, the devastation of the South Britons by Offa, 784, the devastation of Britain by Offa in the summer. In terms of the Welsh kingdom's relationship with Offa, they were mixed at best. However, in regards to the construction of the dyke, the Welsh kingdoms bordering Mercia, Gwent and Powys, may have worked with the Mercians in setting the boundaries for the dyke. John Davies, A History of Wales, tells us that there was a degree of consultation with the kings of Powys and Gwent on the long mountains near Trelliston. The dyke veers to the east, leaving the fertile slopes in the hands of the Welsh. He then further states on Gwent's borders, "There is no more obvious boundary in the whole of Britain than the gorge of the Lower Wye, but assuming that the dyke in that region is part of Offa's project, his men went to the trouble of building the dyke on the crest to the east of the gorge, clearly with the intention of recognising that the River Wye and its traffic belong to the Kingdom of Gwent. Walking along this part of the dyke, it's clear that it would be easy for the Mercians to look deep into Gwent's territories. and as the river makes easy natural boundaries, it made sense to build the Dyke on the Mercian side of the border than trying to infringe and construct it on Gwent's territory. King Offa died in 796, 3 years after the attack on Lindisfarne, and although the Welsh kingdoms would still have to contend with Mercia, a new threat arrived that would change the kingdoms of Britain and Ireland, the Vikings. The first recorded Viking attack in Britain was in 793 at Lindisfarne in the Kingdom of Northumbria. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles tells us of the event. A great famine, and after that, in the same year, the harrying of the heathen, miserable to destroyed God's church in Lindisfarne by rapine and slaughter. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles also record the first time the Vikings came to Britain in 787, although there may have been earlier visits just not recorded, but in this case they killed the magistrate. The subsequently named Viking Age would see great changes in Britain and Ireland. Now we will explore the Welsh kingdom's history with the Vikings. To begin with, the word Viking is a sort of umbrella term similar to Celtic, as when we look under the umbrella, we see various names given, for example, Norse, Norsemen, Danes, Northmen, Raiders, Sea Raiders, Rus, etc. And depending on the source, particularly Christian sources, they wrote down any word that meant raider or pirate. The Annals of Wales tell us that in 796, the first coming of the Gentiles among the southern Irish. The Oxford Dictionary gives the following definition of the word Viking: a member of a Scandinavian people who attacked and sometimes settled in parts of northwest Europe, including Britain, in the 8th to 11th centuries. While the description given is not a bad description, it is not wholly accurate. People from Scandinavia during the time of the Vikings in the 8th to 11th centuries did more than just raid and settle in parts of Europe. They were traders, craftsmen, mercenaries, farmers, bards, explorers and conquerors, etc. There had always been raiders or pirates. The Vikings were the most famous of them, and to the Welsh kingdoms they had dealt with people raiding and settling before, the Germanics and the Irish before the Vikings. Depicted as barbarians by some accounts, however, if we take a look at the sophisticated ships they used to travel across the seas and rivers, that's just one indication that they were more than just pagan barbarians. Yet, there would be a noticeable difference between the Danes that attacked Lindisfarne in 796 to the ones that invaded England in 1066 with Hywel Dda. For one, there would be a difference of religion. By 1066, most of Scandinavia was Christian, and we don't know which part of Scandinavia the Vikings that plundered Lindisfarne came from, whereas Hywel Dda, who is sometimes referred to as the last great Viking and one of the most famous ones, was from Norway. If we look at some of the chroniclers' descriptions of the Vikings, both Christian and Muslim sources, the historian Dudo, based in France here, offers this about the Viking age and expansion. These people who insolently abandon themselves to excess indulgence live in outrageous union with many women, and there in shameless and unlawful intercourse bred innumerable progeny. Once they have grown up, the young quarrel violently with their fathers and grandfathers or with each other about property, and if they increase too greatly in number and cannot acquire sufficient arable land to live on, a large group is selected by drawing of lots according to ancient custom, who are driven away to foreign peoples and realms, so that they by fighting can gain themselves countries where they can live and continual peace. The Islamic sources on the Vikings are rich and full of interesting details. One Islamic scholar, Ahmed ibn Fadlan, who encountered Norsemen at the king of the Bulgars' court near the river Volga, he describes them. I have seen the Roos as they came on their merchants' journeys and encamped by the Volga. I have never seen more perfect physical specimens, tall as date palms, blonde and ruddy. Each man wore a garment which covered his body on one side and left one side free for action. Each man carried an axe, a Frankish-type sword, and a knife with him. Tattoos covered him from fingertip to neck. They drink wine excessively, day and night. Ahmed further comments on them being heathens and that their washing habits were not the most hygienic. If we look at one of the best preserved Viking towns, the description some of the chroniclers have given us get disproved quite quickly. One of the most lucrative source of information on a Norse town during the Viking period is Hedeby, as the archaeological evidence shows us that Hedeby was a centre for trade in the region. The town also had plenty of commercial ventures from merchants, craftsmanship, shipbuilders, etc. Fine goods were also made. The town also minted coinage. As we've mentioned many times before, coinage is an excellent way to showcase or solidify a king's or chieftain's authority. Some of these enterprises are dated as early as the 8th century. The town also featured the first church in Denmark, constructed during the height of the Viking Age in 850, so the quality of the goods being made and traded contradict what some of the chroniclers recorded of Norse society. Now that we've covered a brief outline about who the Vikings were and a small part of their culture and history, we can now look at the impact they had on Wales and the Welsh kingdoms. Wales is the unique one in Britain, as unlike the areas in which today are modern-day England and Scotland, there was never a major large settlement by the Norsemen to the scale of, say, for example, the Danelaw in England, which was the areas in England settled by the Norse. Or in Scotland's case, parts of the mainland and the Isles, which would later become the Kingdom of the Isles. There were small-scale settlements, which we will come to, yet Wales did suffer many raids by the Vikings, along with trading with them, and in some cases even hiring the Vikings to use against or ally with against other Welsh kings, as well as against the emerging power of the Kingdom of Wessex. The first recorded named victim of the Viking raids in Wales was a Welshman called Cynin. The Annals of Wales state Cynin is killed by the Gentiles. We don't know who this person was. The Welsh sources, like other sources, had various names for the Vikings. We will now look at each kingdom in Wales and the history of the Vikings there. Let's start with Gwynedd and a particular location, Anglesey, an island just off the coast of Gwynedd. Anglesey was important to the Kingdom of Gwynedd, as the island featured the capital, Aberfawr, from the 9th century onwards, as well as being the major food provider, from fishing to farming thanks to the flatness and fertile lands. The Vikings raided the island in 853 AD. In 856, the Vikings attacked again, led by a man called Gorm or Orm, yet the Vikings would suffer a defeat inflicted by the king of Gwynedd, Rhodri, later known as Rhodri the Great. We will get into his life in the final episode, The Great Kings of Wales. The battle at Anglesey was a great victory for the Welsh. Although we lack significant details on the battle itself, the victory brought acclaim for Rhodri, as the Viking leader was killed. Anglesey would be safe for a time. The pagan Vikings still raided many churches and monasteries in Wales, similar to everywhere in Britain and Ireland, as they were easy targets to loot, and the monks that were enslaved would be worth something as well. The Viking activity in Gwynedd for a time after the battle was simple hit-and-run raids, hitting small coastal areas or Christian sites. As Wales's terrain is not as flat as, say, for example, England, so large-scale raids across Wales would be more difficult than in England. Yet the Vikings would set up shop for trading for the day before returning to their ships, and some place names in Wales are directly influenced by the Vikings, potentially indicating settlements or integration with the local population. The arrival of the Vikings would see warfare between the English kingdoms and the Welsh kingdoms simmer down for a time, allowing Rhodri to consolidate his kingdom and expand, as perhaps his victory over the Vikings made the Norse warbands think twice before attacking. In 865, the Great Heathen Army arrived, attacking and looting across England, as well as placing puppet kings on the thrones of Northumbria and the once great enemy of the Welsh, the Kingdom of Mercia, which was split in two. And while the Great Heathen Army never attacked the Welsh kingdoms, their actions in the English kingdoms would have an effect, as more Viking attacks began on Wales from 871 onwards, and in 877 King Rhodri had to flee his kingdom to Ireland to gather troops as the Vikings from Dublin attacked Anglesey and the invading force overwhelmed Rhodri's initial defences. He did return in 878, yet in the same year the Viking puppet king of Mercia, Ceolwulf, perhaps with some troops from the Great Heathen Army, attacked and killed Rhodri in battle. And again, we don't have the details on the battle, but his sons would avenge his death against the Mercians at the Battle of Conway, which the Annals of Wales state as the Battle of Conway, vengeance for Rhodri at God's hand. The next mention of the Vikings in Gwynedd is that the eldest son of Rhodri attempted to ally with the Viking kingdom in York in order to counter the powerful English kingdom of Wessex, which had taken Mercia's place as the dominant power in Britain, as under their king, Alfred, later known as Alfred the Great. He had led his troops to victory over the Vikings at the Battle of Edington in 878. This new powerhouse was a threat to Gwynedd. But the alliance with the Vikings in York did not last, as in 893 a new army from Scandinavia started raiding. The threat of this Norse army was enough that the Welsh and the English joined forces to defeat them at the Battle of Buttington. Before the battle, the Viking army had moved into Gwynedd after capturing the fortified city of Chester. The sons of Rhodri, however, resisted the Vikings, and due to the fierce resistance by the men of Gwynedd, the Norsemen headed southwards, clashing with the English-Welsh army there. The actions caused by the Norsemen and their fellow Welshmen's invading each other left the Welsh kingdoms little choice but to accept, whether willingly or begrudgingly, the overlordship from the kingdom of Wessex under Alfred. Despite this cooperation between the Welsh and Wessex, the Vikings would conduct an enormously destructive raid, as the Annals of Wales state. The Northmen came and laid waste Lloegr and Gwent. All of these locations are south of Gwynedd. We can only speculate why the Vikings didn't attack Gwynedd. A band of Norsemen did attack Anglesey in 903, as this group was driven from Dublin by the Irish. But what little settlement they tried to create was soon overwhelmed and forced to flee by the army of Gwynedd. After this period, the Viking activity in Gwynedd declined to opportunistic raids. The next time the Vikings play any prominent role in Gwynedd other than an attack on the capital in 693 was in the 970s, where two rival claimants for the throne had both hired Viking mercenaries. And at the start of the same decade, Norse raids were on the rise again, so much so that the Welsh kings met with the now King of the English, Edgar. Wessex had evolved into the Kingdom of England thanks to the children of Alfred the Great conquering the remaining English kingdoms and the Danelaw lands in the north of England. The meeting was set up in 973 in order for alliances and agreements to be made to protect each kingdom from further Viking attacks or attempted territorial conquests. as in 972, a named Viking leader called Godfrey launched a raid on Anglesey. Godfrey would later ally with a Welsh prince, whose father was a previous king of Gwynedd, but was overthrown. This army then invaded Gwynedd in 980, but was defeated and the former prince was killed in the battle. Godfrey escaped and returned in 987 during an opportunistic time, as Gwynedd had been conquered by another great king, Madadid, king of Deheubarth. As he had just conquered Gwynedd in 986, Madadid didn't have the time to centralise and consolidate his new kingdom, so when Godfrey invaded Anglesey, Madadid retreated to South Wales. The raid conducted was so devastating that we have records of people taken into slavery. Some 2,000 men were taken captive as slaves and later ransomed back. The last raid in Anglesey by the Vikings in the early Middle Ages occurred in 993, as the year 1000 is the start of the High Middle Ages, and this series covers the early Middle Ages. So now we've covered the Vikings' history in Gwynedd. In the next episode, we will view the history of the other Welsh kingdoms and how the Vikings made their mark. Now that we've explored the background of the Vikings and the Viking activity in Gwynedd, we can now move on to other Welsh kingdoms. Now moving on to the next kingdom, Powys. The history of this kingdom during the Viking period is difficult to show, as by the middle of the 9th century, Powys had endured decades of repeated attacks and raids by the English kingdoms, specifically from Mercia. The last independent king of Powys in the early Middle Ages died in exile in Rome in 856. The kingdom would either be conquered or united through diplomacy by the king of Gwynedd, Rhodri the Great. Powys would not become an independent kingdom again until 2 centuries later, in the High Middle Ages. As for Viking activity in Powys during the early Middle Ages, due to the location of Powys, and perhaps Offa's Dyke played a role in protecting Powys, or at that point in history, the Dyke may have fallen into disrepair. We have hardly any information on Vikings in Powys, although the Battle of Buttington is the battle where the Welsh and English kingdoms joined forces to defeat a Viking warband. So it's plausible that the men of Powys would have fought in that joint army. Brycheiniog. Due to the landlocked territory of the kingdom, Brycheiniog didn't suffer as many raids by the Vikings as the Welsh kingdoms with coastal territories did, although the kingdom did suffer from the large-scale raid of the Norsemen in the raid of 896, which included other kingdoms such as Gwent. But for the kingdom of Brycheiniog, the attacks by the Norsemen was not the biggest threat to the kingdom's independence. That came from Gwynedd and Mercia. The small amount of information we have on the threat comes from the Welsh monk Asa, who was the biographer of King Alfred of Wessex. He tells us that the kingdom sought the aid of King Alfred, but how far this protection went ended when Alfred's daughter, Ethelfled, Lady of the Mercians, attacked the kingdom. To what extent of an attack on the kingdom, we don't know, and for the reasons we can speculate, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles tell us about the attack. 916, in this year before midsummer, on June 16th, the day of the festival of St. Quiniris, the martyr, Abbot Egbert, who had done nothing to deserve it, was slain together with his companions. 3 days later, Ethelfled sent an army into Wales and stormed Brycheiniog, and there captured the wife of the king and 33 other persons. In the 930s, the independence of the kingdom was lost again, as Hywel Dda, king of Deheubarth, took control of the kingdom after the last king's death. The kingdom of Gwent. Like Brycheiniog, Gwent suffered from the Norse raid of 896, but the kingdom was subject to a series of raids from 850 onwards. But information from this kingdom is scarce, The Vikings did reappear in 916 and raided the coast of southeast Wales, which would include Gwent, but this Viking band went further into England, attacking around Gloucestershire and Herefordshire. The frustrating issue regarding Gwent is that information about the kingdom over the centuries is that Welsh sources really pay little attention to Gwent during the Viking Age. One reason springs to mind is that because of Gwent's capitulation towards King Alfred of Wessex, this action in turn reduced the kingdom to a petty kingdom or vassal state of Wessex, which the kingdom may have had little choice given the aggression from other Welsh kingdoms. However, we lack the details on the agreement between Wessex and the southeast Welsh kingdoms. Like Powys, Gwent was bordering the English kingdoms, which slowly weakened Gwent against the increasing power of Wessex and later the Kingdom of England. Glywysing. This kingdom's history is often tied with Gwent, as over the centuries the two would form the Kingdom of Morgannwg. The Viking raid of 896 affected areas of Glywysing as well. In 850, we know that the Vikings raided Cardiff and would later settle and trade in areas around Cardiff, possibly using the old Roman fort as a base. The extent of Viking settlements around the Cardiff area was significant enough that several place names are derived from the Norse. How the kings of Glywysing acted towards these attacks and settlements is unknown. The threat of attacks from the Mercians in the 880s was enough that the kingdom sought the protection of Wessex and would later fight alongside Wessex against the Vikings. By the 10th century, the kingdom would ally or submit to King Aethelstan of the newly created Kingdom of England. The Kingdom of Deheubarth is a fusion kingdom consisting of the Kingdom of Ceredigion, Dyfed and Brycheiniog. This kingdom was created in 920 during the Viking Age. Before the kingdom's creation, the Vikings had already created a presence in South Wales with trading stations along the coast. We've looked at the Vikings in Welsh sources as well as Irish and English ones. We do have some Viking sources on Wales. One from the High Middle Ages, the Icelandic Book of Settlements, tells us this. In that book on the reckoning of time, which the Venerable Bede drew up, there is mention made of the island called Thule, which in books is said to be 6 days sailing north from Bretland. Bretland is what the Norse call Wales. Some of the other Norse sources on Wales simply mention accounts of raiding parts of Wales along with other parts of Albion and Ireland, although there is a tale of a Norseman marrying a Welsh princess and gaining half of his new father-in-law's lands. Going back to Viking activity in South Wales, archaeological evidence of Viking settlement show us that there were silver-crafted goods containing ingots and Scandinavian as well as Anglo-Saxon coins dating from the 11th century. Although most of the archaeological evidence we have from Wales is mainly focused on Bronze Age Wales, Roman Britain and the early Welsh kingdoms from 400 to 700 AD, there is very little for Viking settlements in Wales. Although that doesn't mean Vikings didn't settle in Wales, they did and worked as traders, as an Irish source mentions Welsh horses being traded, yet slaves would be the most lucrative source of revenue for the Vikings. Before Dyfed was a part of Deheubarth in the 10th century, the kingdom had lost lands to Ceredigion around the 750s, weakening it and making it ripe for raiding by the Vikings sailing around the Irish Sea in the next century. The coastal city of Swansea is an interesting point for history about Vikings in Wales. Although we have no written records of Viking settlements in Swansea, there are place names. The lack of information on settlements can be attributed to the lack of funding for research and archaeology. The document, A Research Framework for the Archaeology of Wales, explains the reasons. To quote a small part of the entire document, although a very small number of new early medieval sites, including non-elite secular settlements, has been identified and their potential confirmed. Owing to the lack of funding, the only ones being investigated more extensively are those subject to developer funding. Returning to Vikings in Dyfed, one place that saw plenty of attacks was the Cathedral of St David, Dewi Sant. One of the holiest places in Wales meant nothing to the pagan Vikings. The monastery at St David's would be sacked plenty of times during the Viking Age. The attacks that occurred at St David's were not always done by the Norse. They would still attack the site and the surrounding area plenty of times over the course of the Viking Age. One notable raid in 999 AD saw the Vikings kill the Bishop of St David. The killing of such a high-ranking bishop is odd, as the Norse would have made money ransoming the bishop. One case of the Norse ransoming members of the clergy was in 914. A Viking fleet with Norsemen from South Wales and Dublin sailed into the Bristol Channel and kidnapped a group of clergymen. The situation was resolved by King Edward of Wessex, whose army later drove out the Vikings from the Bristol Channel. The raids on St David took their toll, as the site would be abandoned for several years. In an ironic twist, the Normans, the French-speaking Vikings who settled in Normandy, France around the early 10th century, who then took over England in 1066, would be the ones who protected and built the current cathedral. Yet the Vikings would attack and destroy plenty of monasteries in Wales. The ascension of Hywel Dda and the creation of the Kingdom of Rhygyfarch gave stability to southwest Wales, as the kingdoms under Hywel's rule would work together against any Norse attacks or raids. The peace within his kingdoms must have been set, as in 929 Hywel left Wales for a pilgrimage to Rome. The frequency of Viking attacks in his kingdom declined until his death in 950. The kingdoms unified under Hywel were independent again. The fighting that followed between the Welsh kingdoms over the course of the next decades left the kingdoms in Wales open to Viking attacks once again, with sporadic raids over the next decades, even when the power of Rhygyfarch was recreated by King Maredudd after his conquest of Gwynedd. The Vikings still raided heavily into Wales up until the High Middle Ages, and certainly had an impact on Welsh history, helping to forge the tales of some of the great kings of Wales, whose history we will explore next. When it comes to identifying whether an early medieval Welsh king was great or had a significant impact on Welsh history through advancements in laws, warfare, or the further development of Welsh society, we can look for a specific title, the King of the Britons, as this title is used by chronicles to identify Welsh kings who had achieved significant recognition, as most early Welsh kings are simply names on a genealogical list. There have been several kings of the Britons, some historical like Rhodri the Great, or legendary, for example Brutus of Troy or King Arthur. In this long series on early medieval Wales, we've already covered several kings that were described as such, from Cadwallon's conquest of Northumbria to the heroic exploits of Ambrosius Aurelianus. But as we've been exploring these historical figures and others such as the saints, we've been steadily moving towards the end of the early Middle Ages to the High Middle Ages in 1000 AD. As we started from the withdrawal of the Romans from Albion to the Vikings in Wales from the start of the 8th century, and during that period we briefly looked at some of the great kings of Wales and how they dealt with the Viking raids and settlements. From this point of 850 to 999 AD, we have 4 great kings of Wales to cover, and the final one's reign conveniently ends in 999 AD, the last year of the early Middle Ages. Rhodri the Great. We've already shown Rhodri's fight with the Vikings and how his victory over the Black Gentiles gained him fame and prestige. The Annals of Ulster, an Irish source, mentions Rhodri in their chronicles in the year 856 AD. Horm, chief of the Dark Foreigners, was killed by Rhodri, son of Mervyn, king of Wales. The annals mention Rhodri again in 877 AD. Rhodri, son of Mervyn, king of the Britons, came in flight from the Dark Foreigners to Ireland. Rhodri is referred to not only as King of the Britons, but also as King of Wales. This is the first time a Welsh ruler is called this title. At the height of Rhodri's power, he would control most of Wales, although the unity was through Rhodri acquiring the thrones from the death of his relatives. Powys in 856, after his uncle died in exile in Rome. Then in 871, the kingdom of Ceredigion upon the death of his brother-in-law. This unity would be used as a blueprint for later Welsh kings in building their own kingdoms, and also give descendants of Rhodri a claim for the thrones of other Welsh kingdoms. Although information on Rhodri's life is limited, the fact that he is mentioned in chronicles not native to Wales is a testament to his achievements that we know about, especially against the Vikings, as during this period there were not many kings in Albion that could boast they defeated the Vikings to the degree Rhodri had. While the victory over the Vikings brought Rhodri an increased power to project over Wales, it did strike fear into other Welsh kings in the south of Wales, particularly Dyfed and Brycheiniog, as during Rhodri's successor's reign, these smaller kingdoms would seek the protection of Alfred, King of Wessex, showing Rhodri had built a solid power base for his successors to use. By 865, Rhodri had to contend with an old enemy of Wales, the Kingdom of Mercia, as their king launched raids into Rhodri's territory around Anglesey. But the heydays of Mercian power were gone, and the arrival of the arguably best named army ever, the Great Heathen Army, invaded the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, forcing the Mercian king to return home. This new wave of Viking invasions would see Rhodri forced out of Gwynedd and exiled in Ireland in 877 for a short time before returning. Yet Rhodri would die in battle in 878, the Welsh annals state. Rhodri and his son Gordiad is killed by the Saxons. The annals of Ulster state. Rhodri, son of Mervyn, king of the Britons, was killed by the Saxons. Anarod ap Rhodri. One of the many sons of Rhodri the Great, Anarod inherited Gwynedd, while Powys and Ceredigion went to his two brothers. Several different chronicles mention many sons of Rhodri, yet the Welsh chronicles only mention 4, while Asser, the biographer of King Alfred of Wessex, mentions 6, of which Asser is the earliest source to mention the brothers, although he fails to name them. We should not be surprised, as a lack of information on the time period is a recurring theme in this series. Moving on. What's interesting about Anarod's reign is that not only do we have information on his struggles against the Vikings, but also that he was in the midst of a diplomatic flurry between different parties, as there were new Viking kingdoms in the north of England, and with the English kingdom of Wessex now protecting the smaller Welsh kingdoms in the south, not just from the brothers, but also from Mercia. Anarod sought an alliance with the Viking kingdom of York around the 880s, whilst working with his brothers. The details on which the brothers shared power or worked in cohesion with each other is unclear. From the Welsh annals, it implied they worked together as one, whereas Gerald of Wales, a chronicler from the 12th century, mentions the brothers divided the lands between themselves. Regardless, the alliance with the pagan Vikings would not lead to a grand coalition against Wessex. And by the 890s, just like the other Welsh kings, Anarod sought an alliance with King Alfred. Yet his position was stronger than the other Welsh kings, as when he met Alfred, he was given a high king's welcome, lavished with gifts and praise. After all, These two men were the strongest Christian monarchs in southern Albion, and uniting against the pagan warband of Norsemen seeking to conquer would ensure better success at defending their kingdoms. Alfred, King of Wessex, was now overlord of the Welsh kingdoms, but the details on what kind of arrangement Alfred had with the Welsh are lost to us. The notion of a King of Wessex and later Kings of England having overlordship over Wales would have dire consequences for the Welsh in the future. With the kingdoms of Wales in league with Wessex and its allies, protection from Norse attacks would be easier to defend. Yet Anarod took to using his new allies' strength to raid his rivals in South Wales. From the Annals of Wales, Anarod came with the Angles and laid waste Ceredigion and Ystrad Tawi. Why Alfred turned a blind eye to his newest ally raiding the smaller Welsh kingdoms who had sought Alfred's protection in the first place is up for debate. In 905, the kings of Dyfed had died out, as their last king passed away in 904. The deceased king's brother sought to succeed him, but was beheaded in 905. This left Dyfed vulnerable. Anarod and his brother Cacdesh invaded. Cacdesh's heir, Hywel, then became king. That's one story of how Dyfed was taken by the heirs of Rhodri. The other tale is that Hywel married the only surviving daughter of the king of Dyfed. Hywel would inherit his father's kingdom in 910. There are no reported conflicts between Anarod and his nephew. In 916, Anarod died, with the title of King of the Britons being bestowed upon him by the Welsh annals. Anarod, King of the Britons, dies. Hywel Dda, grandson of Rhodri the Great. Hywel carried on his family's legacy of both King of Wales and King of the Britons. He was also the founder of a new kingdom in Wales, Rhygyfarch, consisting of Dyfed, Ceredigion, and later, in 930, the minor kingdom of Brycheiniog. Hywel is a unique early medieval Welsh king, as due to his continued alliance with the Kingdom of Wessex and later the Kingdom of England, he had access to a mint in Chester, creating his own silver coinage, the first Welsh king to do so. He was also a spiritual and pious king, travelling to Rome as a pilgrim, a rare feat as the journey would have taken months, implying that his kingdom was safe for the trip in 928 AD. Later sources even go on to state that Hywel made a return trip to Rome to get his laws blessed by the Pope. Hywel is famous for not only being granted the title of King of Wales and King of the Britons, but also his legacy in the laws of Wales being connected to his reign. The tale of how the laws were codified is that Hywel and the leading men of learning in his kingdoms gathered at Whitland in South Wales. These laws already existed centuries before Hywel's reign. This council was certifying them into legal customs. These laws covered a wide range of social, economical and justice, as well as laws for people of different ranks in Welsh society. There were three types of classes in early Middle Ages Welsh society. The free men, which included the king. These men had ownership of lands and livestock. Next were the unfree people, or subject people. And the last class with absolutely no rights were the slaves. For foreign people living in Wales, they were classed under as astid. These laws represented the development of the Welsh language and the culture during the early Middle Ages in Wales. The existing manuscripts we have detailing the laws are dated from the 13th century onwards, with the earliest copy being in Latin, although other copies are written both in Latin and Welsh. There exists 42 copies of the laws, with 36 written in Welsh and the other 6 in Latin. Hywel's title of the Good, like most titles, is attributed to historical figures at a later date, the same is true for him. The Welsh annals call him the Good, but the annals were comprised years after his death. His title is most likely given through his cataloguing of Welsh laws, as during his reign the kingdoms under his rule prospered. The attacks from the Vikings during Hywel's reign were limited, as we have no records of them attacking Welsh kingdoms. Even the kingdom of the English never attacked the Welsh during this time. Hywel kept to his predecessors' agreements with the English. This attitude was not shared by all Welsh folk. A poem written in the 930s called for all native people of Albion and Ireland to unite and drive out the Saxons, with one line regarding the English: how it is that they do not burst forth because of the dominion of the English and their boasting. During Hywel's later reign, he acquired the kingdom of Gwynedd in 942 upon the death of his cousin, who sought to break free from any agreement with the English. Yet he met his death in battle, and Hywel took advantage and conquered the kingdom, making him now the undisputed master of Wales, with only the small kingdoms of Gwent and Glywysing not under his control. Hywel died in 950, and he certainly earned the title of King of Wales and King of the Britons, as he followed his grandfather in being named King of Wales from an abroad chronicle, the Annals of Ulster. Hywel, King of Wales, dies. Maredudd ap Owain, grandson of Hywel, our final great king of Wales. Maredudd's claim to the title of King of Wales comes from his territorial conquest, as after the death of his grandfather, the kingdoms Hywel accumulated went to different branches of his family, with Gwynedd and Powys returning to Hywel's uncle Anarord's line. Maredudd's reign also saw the rise in Viking attacks upon Wales, and diplomatic relations with the kings of the English breaking down, so much so that Maredudd even tried the folly of allying with the Norsemen of Dublin. This alliance didn't work out, but despite this turbulent time in Wales, Maredudd managed to recreate his grandfather's legacy of most of Wales under one king. He acquired Rhygyfarch upon the death of his father and elder brother in 986, showing far more aggression than his grandfather, as he invaded Gwynedd and killed his distant cousin in the same year. Yet the attacks by the Norsemen pushed him back to Rhygyfarch. This was not the only threat, as in 992 a claimant to the throne named Edwin, with the backing of an English army, invaded. This attempt failed. Maredudd faced many threats to his power until his death in 999 AD. The Chronicle of the Princes is the chronicle that grants Maredudd the title of King of Wales. With Maredudd's death, the early Middle Ages in Wales ended. The High Middle Ages would see the Welsh take on a familiar foe in a different guise in 1066, with the arrival of the Normans after their conquest of England. Yet the High Middle Ages would see the whole of Wales united under one king for the very first time. Thank you all for watching, and a big thank you to the Vlogbrothers for supporting this channel with the Educational Creators Fund.